Merci beaucoup. C'est à moi donc de changer la langue, traverser la Manche et vous présenter, and present you actually, three families, three Romanian intertwined families, the Bibescu, the Știrbei, and the Bibescu-Brancoven, which some of you might know from the very fact that two members of this family were already members of the Institut de France, as well as of the Académie Royale de Belgique. Let me start by saying that these families developed powerful economic, diplomatic and cultural networks in France, in Belgium, in Britain, in Russia, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and that not only attracted political support and prestige, but also conferred substantial influence at home and later in various European circles. A fairly old Western Wallachian family dating back to the 16th century, emerging to political power in the second half of the 18th century, and especially during the 19th, the Bibescu gradually split into three main branches, we shall say, and three cadet branches. One of the main inherited the Austrian-German princely title, the Brancoven, next to the consequent fortune. A second one became known as Știrbei, themselves acquiring the princely title, and the third continued the princely Bibescu line. However, it's interesting that by marriage, the Bibescus became heirs to the last branch of the Wallachian dynasty, and thus were the only ones that could claim political and dynastic legitimacy. And this is why we have George Bibescu, the first sovereign prince of Wallachia until the 1848 revolution, educated in France. His sons, his four sons, that is his brother, founder of the second branch of the family, but his four sons, of which only three are of importance, Grégoire, Nicholas, George, and Alexander, became officers in the French armies. Aware of their heritage, they considered that the heirs of the national Romanian dynasty should return on the throne, not aggressively, but by using the power of law. Diplomacy, international agreements, and support of great powers were the only acceptable approach. In Paris, the Bibescus enjoyed the status of royalty in exile that Napoleon III conferred them. And since the 1850s, the family managed to obtain the support of Europe's powers, such as Austria, whose backing of Grégoire Brancoven was well known, as well as a Wallachian alliance would have secured Austria's commercial interests on the lower Danube. France was also favorable to restoration of the Prince National, as was Russia in the 1840s, in order to block the political growth of the Hohenzollern dynasty in Europe. Family alliances connected the Bibescus and the Brancoven to some leading aristocratic families in France and Belgium, in closer relation to the imperial court in Paris and the Orleanist milieus. A family pact from 1873 between the first three brothers was meant to consolidate their interests and their common initiatives in Romania and Europe. If they were still to use their network of power today, they would still have among the cousins, for instance, Liechtenstein, the future sovereign Liechtenstein, the Giscard d'Estaing, Dominique de Villepin, Philippe de Gaulle, next to his father, and Michel Poniatowski, that you all know were really involved in the French politics. It is him, George II, French officer, historian, member of the Institut de France, who married a Carmen Chimay, who transformed his family's political heritage into a political statement in the 1880s. His foreign allies were significant at a time when Charles of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, Prince and later King of Romania, of German origins and sympathetic to Prussia, was not well seen by France, Austria-Hungary, or Russia. Through his books, interventions, and public conferences, George II designed a political, diplomatic, and economic alternative for his country, challenging the liberal government and the Hohenzollern sovereigns. He considered that a national dynasty, trustworthy and well-connected internationally, should return on the throne as an embodiment of the country's history, traditions, and religion, in a legitimate continuity that they opposed to the foreign, imported, and, well, allegedly unrepresentative ruler. His Romania was a country that was not that did not irritate its neighbors unwisely, nor the great power. It was an ally of France and Britain, a rational ally of Russia, in good terms with Austria-Hungary and with Prussia, which was needed to counterbalance Russia and Austria-Hungary. His ideas were lucid and judicious, as proved to be right when the Franco-Russian alliance became a fact in 1892. Let us therefore see, these were the alternatives he conceived, let us therefore see his, this posterity, the Bibescos and Bracamen acting on the European scene. Antoine Bibesco is rather known for his friendship with Proust, him and his brother Emmanuel. Born in France, he studied in Britain at Canterbury before joining the diplomatic service of Romania in 1899 as an embassy secretary in London. He was appointed first in Washington, D.C. He could not in 1917, but he could not fulfill his duties given the war. But he got back in the American capital in the 1920s. This time, his situation was a bit different as he married Elizabeth Asquith, daughter of Henry Herbert Asquith, the Liberal Prime Minister, a central figure of literary and social London. And this is exactly what managed to connect him to circles of power like the Churchills, the British royal family, or the famous coterie, the intellectual group of the early 1900s. Elizabeth was a writer herself, and when in Washington, she easily befriended Franklin Delano Roosevelt, starting a 20-year-old enmity that would end only with their death. Antoine and Elizabeth functioned as a diplomatic and cultural couple. His personal connections, such as the one with Bernard Baruch, financial and advisor to US Presidents Woodrow Wilson and Roosevelt, facilitated Romania's negotiation for a state loan, much needed after the war. But it is interesting to notice that his success in London and Washington, building in time, displeased Nicolae Titulescu, which you might remember as a well-known Romanian diplomat, foreign minister, and twice president of the General Assembly of the League of Nations, who repeatedly attempted to have Bibesco dismissed. The dispute, actually started by Titulescu and taken very personally, would end only in 1936, when the minister, removed from all official positions, was summoned by King Carl II to leave the country and never to return. In the next appointment in Madrid, it is probably where we have the best example of collaboration between the networks of the two, of Antoine and of Elizabeth. She was a friend of, Antoine was acquainted with King Alfonso XIII. Elizabeth was a friend of Queen Eugenia, and this gave the couple a sort of position de faveur at the Spanish court. While Antoine was representing Romanians' political interests and stood away from conflicting political ideologies, including, for instance, the Republican shift of 1931, Elizabeth was receiving both Spanish liberals and the arrival Primo de Rivera. It was, for instance, to her that Rivera wrote one of her last letters before being executed, and she was the one who tried to save from his fate in the same way she tried to help the French ambassador in Rome, Chambrun, about to be discharged by Léon Blanc, Prime Minister of France and friend of Antoine, because he failed to convince Mussolini not to support the Spanish fascists. But unfortunately, she did not succeed. Well, Elizabeth died in 1945. Antoine, because of the communists, had to flee the country in the same year, going to Paris, where he used his personal connections in the British diplomacy with Duff Cooper and Harold Nicholson to have access to the American circles discussing Europe's future. His objective was to intervene in ways that could serve Romania's interest, to be recognized as co-belligerent of the United Nations and not as a condemned ally of Germany, to preserve as much as possible the frontiers of 1948, if not 38, and to see that the country stays independent. That is, unfortunately, not what happened. As we know, the outcome of the Second World War proved to be for Romania the worst in its entire modern history. We shall see then the pragmatic Prince Bibesco, who was, first of all, a sportman, and who embarked in an international career that was to bring him the presidency of the World Air Federation. This is an interesting one because the World Air Federation played a political role in the 1920s and 30s that was never replicated ever since. Created in 1905, it gradually became not only an institution dedicated to air sports and world records, but a platform reuniting ministries of air and of aviation from different European countries and the United States. It also had a diplomatic, strategic, and military potential, as most of the national delegates had political or military ranking that were connected to the aircraft manufacturers in their countries, like Blériot, Poté, Zodiac, Vickers, Rolls-Royce, Fiat, Hispano-Suiza. And the decisions taken were often politically influenced. George Bibescu wanted to reform the institution, and that meant, firstly, by transforming it into a respected international institution regulating world's commercial aviation, as airliners, seaplanes, and airships were seen more profitable than Atlantic liners and railways. Secondly, exploring and opening new airways to connect European countries. Thirdly, facilitating air travel. But for Bibescu, airspace was a source of prosperity, and because of it, a source of mature reconciliation between nations. This is why reconciling France, Germany, and Italy stood high on his agenda, next to developing aeronautics in southeastern Europe. A new era of harmony and understanding, and I quote him, had to begin under the leadership of so many political personalities involved in the World Air Federation, preparing for peace. Civil aviation would become the very soul of international exchanges in all fields. This is what he conceived. And one of the interesting ideas he promoted back then, for instance, was when he invited Louise Weiss, French journalist and activist for peace, surrounded herself by brilliant intellectual names, and some of them were already mentioned, from Henri de Jouvenel to Vladimir d'Ormesson to Briand, Herriot, Léon Blum, Saint-Jean-Perse, Valéry, etc. To her, therefore, he wanted to demonstrate the stupidity, I quote, the stupidity of a peace with no means of preservation, all the decisions, convictions, judgments, and decrees falling into the void. He wanted the establishment of an international air force, a coalition, the only gendarmerie possible. It was a beautiful dream. His wife, who is narrating the episode, writes. He therefore considered in 1935 the creation of a world air force carrying out the peacekeeping mandate of the League of Nations. Among other initiatives, private initiatives worthy to be mentioned, is, for instance, the long talks he had with Philip Sassoon, the British Undersecretary for State here, in 1933, when Bibescu suggested the reinforcement of Britain's coastal aerial defense, as the German aviation was about to become the most powerful in Europe. It was the same warning that he later addressed to Lord Londonderry, Secretary of State for Air during the MacDonald government, and second cousin of Winston Churchill. The last thing he could achieve before dying in 1941, that was in December 1939, was to offer the Federation's services to the International Red Cross, a proposal unanimously accepted now that diplomacy had been replaced by warfare. We also have Constantine Brankoven, which you might know his sister better. She was one of the first members, female members of the Académie Royale de Belgique. In his case, what is interesting, besides his immense fortune, besides his many businesses he was involved in, is the idea to act, because he was his social and cultural interests were in France. His patrimony was located in Romania. He moved constantly between France and Romania. So he chose to be an advocate of his country in what we call today a cultural diplomacy. He founded, for instance, the Renaissance Latine. It was a monthly magazine destined to revive the interest of the French public and political elite for the other Romance-speaking nations in Europe and the Americans. The magazine was dually structured in order to discuss and debate not only most recent developments in the economy, society, culture, and politics of the Latin nations, but also themes of interest. However, the magazine did not survive much, and Brankoven returned to his political interests, which were rather social liberal, inspired to him by the French solidarisme of Léon Bourgeois. And after assuming a few para-diplomatic missions during the First World War, for instance, especially negotiating the common Romanian-Italian position in 1915 with respect to their neutrality or not during the war, his interests converted to industry and finance after 1919. He became shareholder and president of different banking, mining, and petroleum corporations created with French and Belgian capital. He did not, however, neglect his diplomatic concerns. He was a member of the Académie Diplomatique Internationale in Paris, and Among his confrères, there were Briand, Edward Beneš, Gustav Stresemann, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was also interested in the codification of the international law, minorities in Europe, the International Court of Justice, and the organization of peace by the League of Nations, the Bryan-Kellogg Pact, so on and so forth. I would also mention that it is in these milieux that, for instance, he met André Charadam, who is considered today to be one of the founders of the French geopolitics. Brankoven did not actually share Charadam's arch anti-German opinions, but he organized various conferences for Charadam in Romania, where the French scholar expressed his opinions on the containment of Germany, which was needed after 1933, and accused France and Europe for their lack of boldness in confronting what was obviously Germany's shrewd policy to dominate the continent. Well, Brankoven left behind less traces than his cousins, but he was innovative when deciding to use his business network in order to amplify economic collaboration and increase the degree of interdependence between the advanced European economies and the growing East, anchoring one to the other, especially in the strategic field of oil extraction. If we go to another cousin, and it is one of the last we are discussing, he's Barbeau-Stirbey. With a beautiful political career in the country. And he was a very intimate friend of Queen Marie of Romania. The interesting part in his biography, and this is why I included him, is the crucial, well, the most dramatic episode that took place during the Second World War. Romania's attempt to get out of the German alliance. As the Nazi Germany was confronted with immense losses in Russia and it became obvious that they cannot win, Romania considered negotiating since 1943 its way out of the war. In 1942, the American government informed Romania through private channels that withdrawing the armies from the Soviet territory behind the frontier lines of 1940 is acceptable and understandable. Advancing would be a strategic mistake. 1 year later, Marshal Antonescu, next to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the leaders of the democratic opposition, joined their efforts and sent various messages to London, Washington, and Moscow, both officially and in private. Yet, very aware of the unnatural alliance between the Anglo-Saxon powers and the Soviet Union, Romania hesitated. For historical reasons, we have 12 Russian invasions in 150 years. If it sounds familiar, I fully understand. Long military occupations and land annexations. The country's diplomatic agents preferred to negotiate only with Britain and the United States and not with Soviet Russia. What Romania was asking for in 1943 were British and American guarantees for the country's frontiers and a fair truce treaty. If Romania was to negotiate with the Soviets, that had to be done only with the Anglo-American undertaking of the outcome and their formal assurance. However, it was impossible. It was in these circumstances that Barbeau-Stirbey, who used the code name Bond, is allowed to go to Ankara and Cairo to negotiate with the Allies. Firstly, because he was a skilled negotiator. Secondly, he was at the center of an intelligence network that offered him both the means and the credibility to negotiate. Of his 4 daughters, one had married John Boxall, the head of the MI6 office for Romania. Another one was the wife of the Romanian ambassador in Turkey. And the third one was the spouse of the state official head of the Cipher Bureau. So if you could wage the war, you could at least do it from home. In 1944, he met British diplomats in Ankara. He suggested the creation of the Eastern European Federation, which is a large project superposing a bit Churchill's idea of a Danube Federation. He delivered Romania's proposal, a military volte-face against Germany, if Romania could receive guarantees. Unfortunately, while initially the Americans agreed, as the Soviet armies advanced in Eastern Europe, it was impossible from now to separate the withdrawal of Romania from the war from any negotiation with the Soviet Union. He was appointed, or almost about to be appointed, Prime Minister in 1945 by the young King Michael. It was a strategy of appeasement, an attempt to diminish the Soviet influence in the country. In addition, Shirvey's British connections were vital in balancing Moscow's political pressure. The Soviets imposed a new prime minister, and Vyshinsky, former state prosecutor and minister of foreign affairs, deliberately came to Romania in early March 1946 to make sure opposition is handled properly. Apparently, it was because Barbu Știrbei died the next day after attending the Soviet embassy reception he was invited to. And the last one, and I hope I'm still on time, is Marbi Besco. She was the last member of the family, member of the Académie Royale de Belgique. She was described by her biographers as the last Belle Époque orchid, or the enchantress. It depends on the biographer. She was a writer and aesthete, but she also, and this is the interesting part, she was also one of the main contributors to what we call cultural diplomacy in the 1930s, because not only she was born in a family where she could easily perceive the political realities and understand Romania's national interest. Her father, for instance, had been a diplomat serving as Minister of Foreign Affairs, and her mother was a Mavrocordato princess. This offered her, and Louise Weiss noted, a very European perspective of her identity, and I left her, I put it at the last, because she is the one who embraced the cultural view, the entire diplomatic approach that could be achieved and was achieved in private. Louise Weiss, for instance, and I quote her, notices, from her numerous and glorious family alliances, Marbi Besco had created an imaginary map built on blood streams. The most famous places of the continent were thus united by rivers belonging to her literally, and whose history she liked to treasure. At the end of each of these genealogical rivers, when they were about to lose their ways into the Acheron, a phoenix, a savior, was born again, known only to her, provoking their birth. It was actually a metaphor for the European unity that she would like to have seen done in the same way her own family, which was extended and with lots of connections in Europe, had achieved. For instance, a spirit of openness, and you have the palace of Mogoșoaia in the picture, a spirit of openness presided over her residences, especially there at Mogoșoaia, which was a symbol of the old Romanian monarchy, where she offered dinners for British, French, American, German, Spanish, and Swiss diplomats. For instance, or the closing reception in 1931 of the Congress of the World Air Federation. Her spiritual conversation, the excellent cuisine, the historical grounds made her invitations thought after. And the glittering international society gathering there turned Mogoșoaia into, I quote Louis Barthou, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, the second Geneva or the second League of Nations. He was himself a visitor. This sophistication, comprehensive understanding of circumstances and proximity to the political milieus of Europe turned Marbi Besco, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, into a privileged diplomatic messenger. And I noted, I did not include it in this paper, but I just discovered a few days ago, for instance, the 1915-1916 project that the German Crown Prince asked her to promote in the political milieus of Paris that she was familiar with, an independent peace plan during the First World War, where France would gain Alsace and Lorraine, but Belgium would be split between the two countries. And Marbi Besco immediately answers that this is something that the French government would never accept, first of all because Belgium was a victim and France would not accept integrating territories coming from a victimized country. And secondly, the Belgians were already heroes. So why accepting to betray political allies during the war? In 1942, it was again through her that a U.S. minister to Switzerland, Leland Harrison, previously U.S. minister to Romania, notified Marshal Antonescu on the American opposition of Romania's pursuit of war. What can I say about, well, let's see, trying to conclude on her personality, is she had a very Chateaubriand approach. She liked to be both involved in literature, because she was a writer, but also with a certain diplomatic initiative that she cultivated and that she liked to perform from time to time. The most eloquent book she wrote, for instance, from this perspective, is La Nymphe Europe in 1960. That, for instance, Richard von Coudenhove-Kalergi described as a symphony of history, philosophy, and mythology. It is the history of Europe perceived through her own family's political experience in the last 300 years. She called it Mes mémoires d'infra-berceau. If we keep in mind that les mémoires d'outre-tombe of Chateaubriand. It was therefore a reflection of the European unity achieved by a transnational family. And eulogies followed the publication, and most representative of, were the opinions of Charles de Gaulle, Mart's friend in the 1960s, who writes her, "What a view and what a perspective, what a history and what a recounting. You've depicted Europe." This can be, of course, still read and analyzed. But what is interesting in our conclusions, is the fact that we have a family that was, well, of course, triple, many times involved in political decisions, both in Romania and with a bit of influence by offering information, by sometimes by the various systems of intelligence of every country, on what could be the next political movement to make, especially in what concerned the relationship between the great powers and the East, the European East. Shall we remember that in the 1920s we have Soviet Russia that stays away from the political conflict of Europe, and we have a Germany that still struggles to find a place. The situation was complicated. Some of the perspectives brought in, or the political ideas conceived, for instance, federation of the Danube countries, or an Eastern European federation, could rebuild peace, could help Western powers to actually stabilize the continent and pacify Europe. This would be it. Thank you.